Welcome to The Accidental Trainer, a podcast where you'll hear firsthand stories and tips on how to start and grow your training career.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of ATD Accidental Trainer. I'm your host, Alexandria Clapp, and today we have with us the lovely Erin Diehl. Erin is the CEO of Improv. She's a podcast host, a best-selling author, recovering people pleaser, and so much more. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you, Alexandria. It's so funny to hear you say all those things. I think the recovering people pleaser is what I identify with most, but I'm so excited to be here.
Welcome, welcome. Yeah, I felt like I had to toss that in there because I think a lot of people have a negative connotation with people pleasing. Of course, I could just jump into a whole conversation about that right now. But first, I want to make sure that I prime folks with our topic. And we were just talking in the green room that I didn't even want to pin down what we're talking about because there's so many things I want to talk to you about. Improv, failure, improv in the context for talent development. So we're going to just chat about a bunch of things, see where the conversation takes us. We talked a little bit about not getting too prepared so we don't have an overscripted conversation, which will be really fun for us and hopefully for our listeners. So we'll get into that shortly. But first, let's talk a little bit about your origin story, knowing that this is the short version and there's so much more to it. But how did you land in your current role? And will you share something accidental that happened along the way?
Yes. Oh, I love this little twist. That's fun. Okay. Cliff's Notes version. Growing up, literally wanted to be a talk show host my entire life. Oprah was my North Star. And so what does one do to become Oprah? She goes to college and gets a communications degree. And what does one do after they graduate college with that communications degree and want to become Oprah? You move to the city where she lives, which is Chicago. And so I fell accidentally in improv class. There's a lot of accidents. There's a lot of happy accidents around the way. So I took my first improv class at Second City in Chicago. When I opened the doors, I was like, oh, I'm home. These are my people. I can be a weirdo. I can let myself loose and just totally allow myself to immerse myself in play. And so throughout my 20s, I did a variety of different things, a lot of MC and hosting work. And then I found myself wanting to get off the road. I was traveling a lot and I started working in recruiting. Now, I know we have a ton of people in HR, a ton of learning development and HR leaders listening in on the call today. Listen, accidentally did I fall into that path. There was never a world where I thought I'm going to become a recruiter. There was never a world that I thought I'm going to do business development for a recruiting firm. Talk about doors getting slammed in your face. I literally had a door slammed in my face one time when I was doing a visit to a client. So that job taught me so much about networking and building relationships and creating real, not transactional, authentic journeys and relationships with clients that when I found myself really immersing myself in my improv career at night and on the weekends, I saw everything really spill over into my day-to-day. And I was noticing that everything I was doing at my improv life, I had two careers at the time, was really making me better at my job. I was a better networker. I was more communicative. I was a better listener. I was more empathetic. It just all translated and the idea for Improv was born. So at the time, one of my clients was United Airlines and I pitched them the idea to pilot, pun intended, a workshop to them. They said yes, and the rest is history. I've been the founder of Improv for almost 11 years. Can you believe that? That is so crazy. But my path was not linear. There are a lot of failures and accidents along the way, and I learned from every single one.
Love it. I couldn't help but hold on to the fact that you did improv at Second City, which is pretty famously known for improv. And I think Amy Poehler did her little stint there, started her career there as well. So that's pretty cool.
There's so many theaters in Chicago. Chicago is really sort of the mecca for improv. And so I did Second City, the IO. It was formerly Improv Olympic and the Annoyance Theater, and another theater that no longer exists, but was awesome called Under the Gun. And every theater had a different philosophy and different way of teaching the art form of improv. And so I'm so grateful I had all those different schools of thought to pull from to create what we do.
So it's funny, I can't help but think of games like Zip Zap Zop and Bus Stop and Yes and all these things. I know a lot of our listeners have a theater background and acting background. So maybe not specifically improv, but they practice a little bit of these techniques. Then we have some personalities who are They're not a theater person. They're like, enough of this kumbaya. I do not want to get in a room and practice acting as a team building exercise. And that is okay. I want to help set the scene so that if you think that's where this conversation is going, that there's something for everyone. Folks can cultivate skills from adopting this improv comedian or actor's mindset, regardless of the role that you have.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. And you and I kind of touched on this before we hit record. A couple things. I have 22 facilitators on my team, myself included. Of those 22 facilitators, I would say 18 identify as an introvert. There's me and probably a few others who would call themselves extroverted people. The best improvisers that I've ever witnessed on stage are some of the most analytical thinkers in the world, because improv is not about getting on stage and being the class clown, which I, by the way, was in high school. And I failed miserably at improv in the beginning because I was trying to go for the joke. It's actually the opposite. The best improviser is listening and then reacting and responding in the moment to the last thing that was said. So it's truth. So they call it the truth in comedy. That's where the comedy lies, when you are organically having conversations that pick up what the last person said, add to it, which is yes and at its finest, and continues a conversation. We are doing this all day in our jobs. You and I are doing it literally right now. We are improvising. Like, we are all improvisers, but when we label it as such, that's when people get the sweaty armpits and they start to feel uncomfortable in their own skin. I call it the ick factor. And our job, what we do, is not to ever make anybody feel uncomfortable. It's actually to get comfortable with the uncomfortable and to pull out their highest self through play. You'll find that when you start doing an improv activity, it feels awkward, but once you start doing it with the entire room, it feels so communal. It's so beautiful to facilitate and beautiful to witness, because no group is ever the same. And people find such joy. It's like you reconnect with this like 8-year-old version of you. It really does bring out the best in people. And then you can have really authentic conversations through play. And that's why we use it as a teaching tool. And so anybody listening who's like, that is not me, I quit, I'm pressing pause, I'm getting out of my car and stopping this conversation. I want you to listen and just know you are so not alone. And we have so many doubters, but we have always turned those doubters into believers by the end of a session, because we say in improv, if you're not having fun, you're the jerk. There is another name for that, but it's like you're the person that's choosing to not join in this beautiful community who is welcoming you and has your back. So join in. Let us embrace you with open arms and try something new.
I love that you said being comfortable with being uncomfortable. That is just my life motto. For those folks who are listening, I'm sure that you could fill in the gap and say that's how you define learning. Of course, like being able to define play, being able to say that that is sort of the underlying pillar takeaway from cultivating this mindset, kind of the skill set is so huge. My husband was telling me he worked at DOJ once upon a time, and a couple of the lawyers there described one of the smartest things they ever did was take an improv class to help them think on their feet and to be able to adjust quickly from making a mistake and being able to build off of unexpected something that happens in the conversation, all sorts of skills, like you said, that just come in handy all the time, whether you're in a tricky, sticky meeting or tricky project or who knows what it is. I would love to kind of talk about some specific examples. If you have any cool stories, whether it's for you or teams that you've worked with, for navigating sort of a tricky workplace challenge.
Anytime we work with a client, and know that we work from Fortune 100 to mom and pop shops and small businesses, what we are identifying when we work with people is, what is your pain point? What is the challenge? And what we hear a lot of right now, because it depends on what year we're in, right? So 2020 was this year of like, how am I engaging my hybrid workforce? As we moved back into the real world, once the pandemic was over, it was really about how am I getting people back in the office and really connecting with each other? And now what we're hearing a lot of is really, how can I connect with people in a different way? And so I'm trying to just think of a very specific challenge that it was a challenge, but we overcame it. And I think it was a really beautiful thing that sets up how improv can impact company culture. So American Marketing Association was our client in the very beginning. We've worked with them for years. And they came to us and they said, we really want to change our culture. They did a complete office rehaul. So they used to have siloed offices. They made everything rows. So everybody was sitting together. Even the CEO had a glass office. So like you could see into his office, right? And they wanted us to help them develop core values so that they could incorporate part of the improv mindset into their day-to-day. Through a series of workshops, one of the most prominent things in improv is yes and, which you talked about. We really discovered that as American Marketing Association, they actually felt like they were playing too inside the box and that things weren't getting done in terms of innovation because they were the way things had always been done. So we used this core value of yes and to really make sure that it was incorporated to every brainstorm, to every piece of marketing collateral, to everything you do. You walk around American marketing offices now, because it is a core value, yes and is on the doors to their office meeting rooms. There are pamphlets near everybody's desk where yes and exists. There's little reminders about yes and in the break rooms. And it just fosters this community of inclusion, connectivity, collaboration. They have had so much growth as an organization over the past few years. It's been a joy to watch. I do know that they are still thriving and they're really utilizing that core value into every single thing that they do, which makes me so proud. I really think if everyone could adopt a yes and mindset, this world would be a better place.
I imagine that you can get some pushback from folks for, again, sort of what we talked about earlier, like, I don't know if that's for me. The buy-in piece might be tricky. Any tips for how you sort of win people over?
That's a really good question. So when I think people think of us, we train on soft skills. Soft skills are actually the hardest thing to develop. You can learn a software, you can take a course and learn how to build a website. You can learn how to do things with directions, but changing the way we behave as humans is really difficult. For us, we've started to measure the ROO when we work with clients, the return on your objectives. So we make sure we get really, really, really specific with the client. What are your pain points? What are your challenges? We understand those so much so that it almost feels like therapy. Like when we have discovery calls, we're getting to know you and your organization on a very deep level, and you're sharing very intimate secrets with us so we can help be your painkiller. We're not a vitamin. We're going to come in and we're going to take the challenge that you're having. And we have 11 different offerings, have a service offering. And that's in terms of workshops. We have things beyond that as well. But we have something that we can come in and we can say, here's this very specific problem. Here's how we're going to address it. Here are the objectives. We'll measure success if you feel these objectives are met. And if we work with a client once, we call that a culture jumpstart. If we work with them over time, we call that a culture shift. If we work with them over 6 months or over 6 engagements over a period of 2 years, we call that culture change. And then we can see the culture really change. But it's not just this like willy-nilly woo-woo in and out conversation. We have pre-work, we have the live event, we have post-work. And so everything we do, we are first and foremost a professional development company that uses improv to train people. But everything we do is with the ROO in mind. And we are so clear on that before we do anything with anybody, because there's no point in working with us if it's just a team building experience. That's what we've told people year over year. That's what we were started out as. And as we grew, we really understood, wow, we are changing cultures and teams and minds and people. And it's developed into this really awesome professional development company that I'm so proud of. I truly am. I see the change. So I was just in an article for the New York Times. It wasn't the article that really took me by surprise. It was the social feedback after posting about it that I received from so many people who have worked with us, the impact that the sessions and the work that we've done with them has had on their lives. It was so moving to me how this work helps people see the highest version of themselves. They're stopping judgment of themselves. They're stopping judgment of others. They just allow themselves to feel good.
You've mentioned a little bit about culture and what that looks like. And I hesitate to even ask this question because I think that the answer is very similar and the same, but just for the sake of continuing to dig on in, how can trainers use improv techniques if they're focused on fostering more inclusive or engaging learning environments specifically? And I know, again, that's silly because you would be learning in your culture and in meetings and all the time, not just in this separate silo of this is my learning space, but I'll ask it anyways.
I mean, we partner with DEI leaders, ERG groups all the time. And I think that work is so meaningful. Improv is all about inclusivity. You can't do an improv activity and be exclusive. You have to involve everyone in the room. And we always say everything that we do is going to be some type of team collaborative experience, but we have a skill that we're training you on top of that. So yes, and is this mindset that's come up before. So let me just explain it in greater detail for anybody listening who doesn't know what yes, and is. Yes, and is this idea on stage. Let's say you and I are in an improv scene, Alexandria, it's just you and I. And I'll show you what yes and done the wrong way looks like. So just come to me and tell me a problem that you have going on in your life.
My microphone just blew up and I think we're going to have to stop talking right now.
I think we should stop. That's a no. We have nowhere to go. This conversation would end literally if there would be no podcast. However, if you said that same thing to me and I yes-anded it without using the words yes and, it would look like this. Can you say it again?
My microphone just blew up. I don't know what to do. I think we should stop having this conversation.
I hear you. You know what's so funny? I had that same microphone and I had the same problem. But if you just press that button on the back a couple of times and the light flickers, it'll turn back on. And then we just go from there, right? So I didn't necessarily say the words yes and, but I said, oh, I hear you. And that's what yes and is. It's a, yes, I hear you. Thank you for contributing. And I'm going to add something. So in a great improv scene, you would bring a line of dialogue. I would bring a line. You would bring a line. And we'd build this beautiful house of bricks of our ideas. And it's our own house that we built together. Just not my house, not Alexandria's house. It's our house we built together. So when you use that same concept in a work environment, you make everyone feel seen, heard, and valued by saying thank you for contributing your ideas. You don't negate it. You don't say no on the upfront. You thank them for asking or bringing it to your attention. And then you add something to it. You're postponing judgment of them, which makes them want to share more ideas. So the idea is with yes and, the more times that you allow people to feel seen, heard, and valued, people want to show up. When people want to show up, productivity rises. When productivity rises, we all thrive, right? The organization and the human. So that's one way that we really use improv to help foster these collaborative and inclusive environments. And then I have so many different activities that can help with that. And we actually are launching a new workshop called Radical Empathy. And I have a keynote called The Empathetic Leader that helps people understand how important empathetic leadership really is. And what it really boils down to is instead of just walking in somebody's shoes, you slip them on, walk around for a minute, get a blister, and then hand it back to them and say, oh man, I know what you mean. And then help them from there. Improv really, every single activity, every single teaching point is allowing everyone to share their ideas and add to it.
I want to go back to our example and I want to try to be meta and create an example of what people are going to run into and what is your recommendation for dealing with it, which is that I'm pretty sure that you give me a really bad idea. You say, hey, if you just take that microphone and you run it underwater, pop it in the shower, it should just work in no time. Just go run and do that, come back. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure that this is going to break the microphone if I run it underwater. How do I yes and what I think is not only a bad idea, maybe even wrong, but you know what I mean?
I get you. And this is so good. I love that. A couple of things that run through my mind when you say that. So the wrong way to do that, right? So if you were looking at me, you're like, Erin, that's a really not a smart idea. It's going to break the microphone and probably blow up my house or my workspace, wherever I'm at. No, I'm never going to come up to you with another idea, right? Like I'm never going to say, try this little thing. However, if you still think my idea sucks and you're like, I am never going to do it, she said, however, you don't want to negate me or shut me down, you can yes and me. Now, people get confused where yes and means I have to agree. It actually doesn't mean that. And that's why I like to show examples where I'm still yes anding, but not using yes and. So if you were to reply back to me with yes and, it would look like, yes, and you know what? I have another idea. What if we go to the bathroom and we try the plug in there? So you're still taking a part of my idea, but you're not telling me I'm stupid. If you didn't yes and with the words yes and, it could be like, oh, interesting. I like to use interesting when I don't agree with something. Interesting. Why don't we try to take the cord out from the bottom and plug it back in first and see if that works? So you're still not negating me and you're telling me, interesting. Thank you for sharing, right? I'm not necessarily agreeing with your idea, but why don't we try this? And then it doesn't make me feel bad. I don't feel stifled. This is in work settings. This is in personal settings. This is in all the settings. When you allow somebody to feel heard and seen, they are more willing to show up and you're going to come to a conclusion together versus one person who is potentially the leader running the show. Let's say we got this microphone to work again by us yes-anding each other. We keep going back and forth and we finally get this microphone to work. And we're so excited. We're like, heck yeah. And we high five. That is so much cooler than having you just sit there and fix it and me sulk in a corner. And we can celebrate that success together and move on to the next thing. And from that experience, I'm going to remember how I felt with you because people remember how they feel versus words most of the time. And I'm going to want to do it again.
Yeah, I think it's fun to kind of walk through. This is fun for me. What might very well be realistic challenges. And there's tricky territory to be able to give them the space to have ideas and collaborate. But maybe in your mind, you're like, I'm pretty sure I've tried that before. I have dumped that microphone right into the sink. And guess what? It blew up. And I keep using that example because I think in an improv like scenario, those things that are unexpected takes the scene into like a new direction that you weren't expecting. And it's funny, right? Those moments are funny. I don't know if those moments are funny in a workplace setting, though maybe you have the perspective of, no, those failures are funny and fun. And you have this camaraderie of someone that you're doing it with. I love that idea. I can see someone feeling like, you know what, I'm already drowning. I don't have time to be giving people space for all these failure ideas and saying, yay, this is fun that we're doing it together. Like, you're wasting my time. I'm trying to be this person, the devil's advocate, like the negative Nancy listening and having trouble with all this.
Can I share an example with you that I think really hits on what you're talking about? Because I hear you, right? And that's a yes and. I hear you. I just yes-anded you. Real example I'm sure a lot of people can relate to. In 2020, when the world shut down, my business was completely in person. I did not have a digital leg to stand on. There was two types of leadership. One is yes and is like the go-to, right? Like that's your day-to-day. Do that as often as possible. But when you need to step in and lead, because that is the only option and it is critical that you are the leader, sometimes you have to jump in and just say, hey, normally we're going to yes and each other and we're going to collaborate to come up with ideas. In this emergency scenario, we're going to try what I'm saying. And so I had to do that. My company is built on yes and. It is a core value. And I had to step in 2020 and say, here's how we're going to get ourselves out of this hole. We're going to try it and then we're going to fail and we're going to reiterate. And we had about 7 pivots in 2020 and 2021 and we figured it out. But it started off with me saying, this is a critical time. I'm going to give some direction and we're going to try it and then we can figure it out together. So I do think in critical situations, yes and can go out the window. And then as you figure it out and build the plane while you're flying it, so to speak, you can yes and through collaboration to problem solve. But sometimes when critical things arise, you have to make the calls and you have to step in as a leader and do that. That is an example that is really strong and I will never forget because 98% of the time, my team is led by a yes and leader. I will always listen to their ideas. And if I don't agree, I will yes and it and we'll come up with something better together. I collaborated with them through the pivots. I needed their input. I needed their buy-in. I needed them to tell me, here's what's working, here's what's not, but not to shut me down. Yes and is a company retention tool. It's an attraction tool. There's so much more I could say about it, but I hear you on the part about you can't do it all the time. There are these critical scenarios where you have to step in and make decisions, but you can yes and through problem solving together.
I feel like we're doing a really nice segue into failure, which I really want to talk to you about, but I can't help but tack on one more topic with this yes and concept, which is you said that you identified most with the label of recovering people pleaser.
Yes.
And to me, I can imagine someone listening and saying to themselves, well, great. This is just more of a trap of being in people pleasing with yes and. Again, I keep going negative.
It's okay. It's
just so that you can speak directly to those folks and show them how you can get away from people pleasing and still have a yes and mentality.
Listen, okay, everybody, let me say this. People pleasers out there would not say that they're great yes-anders either. For me, I moved a lot in my childhood and I was constantly having to readapt. And the way that I found myself being liked was through humor and was also just by saying, yes, let me do what you want to do and negating my own needs. And that goes back to the example that yes and does not mean you have to agree. It does not mean you have to agree. For me, the recovering people pleaser is a work in progress. It comes from a deep need and childhood desire to be liked. And I have been working on it and I'm a serious work in progress. But what I ultimately realized is I want to leave a legacy on this earth with my business and with the work that we do in the world. I want to leave a legacy for my son who's 5.5. I want the world when I leave this earth to feel like the purpose that I brought was joy and was happiness and was kindness and compassion. And what I did for about 38 years of my life was make other people happy before making myself happy. And what I learned through a very painful experience, and by pain, I mean chronic pain, like physical pain in my body, was that if you don't give to yourself first, you cannot give to anybody else. And so I really did a lot of work, internal work, to process those emotions. I now have no physical pain because I healed myself by doing the internal work and I put myself first before anybody else. So yes and does not mean you have to agree with anyone. Yes and means you say yes to yourself first before you give to somebody else.
I love it. It makes me think of the Body Keeps score book that you were able to help get rid of, expel some of that chronic stress and pain that was being held in your body.
And no medicine, no surgery, nothing. It just went away after lots of therapy and journaling and meditation and holistic healing practices. So yeah, the people pleasing was real.
Gosh, I know we could keep talking about this. I'm tempted, but you have a lot of philosophies on navigating failure. That always resonates with me so deeply. I just think it's a beautiful mindset to be able to overcome failure. And I've heard, I can't reveal who, but I've heard chief talent development officers say, we claim to have this like learning culture where failure is accepted, but it's actually not. It's a big problem. And we know that we're creating dissonance, cognitive dissonance, but we can't accept it. So I know we have folks listening who they're feeling that dissonance because they have the same challenge in their organization. I'm so curious for your thoughts on navigating failure. I know you have this M.O.V.E method, and I warned you, I'm going to just hand you a bunch of different questions or topics and you can choose how to address it because we're running out of time. Like sharing a failure story, sharing your M.O.V.E method. How do we deal with it? How do we start this conversation?
Yes. Let me start here with a failure story and then I'll apply the M.O.V.E method. How about that? A lot of organizations say that they value failure and they're run by a bunch of perfectionists. Okay. Failure is literally how I got here. I think what I even developed the content that I did around failure, which I have a keynote called F Words at Work. You kind of teach what you need to know. And the time that I was building that was when I was going through the period of time I call the 3 Ps, which is I was pivoting the business due to COVID. I was people pleasing and I was in chronic pain. And I call those the 3 Ps or the 3 PUs because literally it was the stinkiest time of my life. And it wasn't because I had a toddler who was still in diapers. It was literally the worst time of my life. And I was like, man, I know women especially feel me. There's this load that we carry. And how do I get myself out of that? So I started labeling that period of my time as my WTF, which is not a swear word. It is my worst terrifying failure. And on top of that, my mom had a stroke during that time period. She was in ICU during COVID. It was horrible. So how do I get through this WTF period? And I developed a method called Move On. And that's what I teach in my keynotes. That's what I teach when I talk to people about failure. And I'm going to share it here because I think it's so important. Move On is an acronym. The M stands for marinate. You cannot just say, oh, I failed, and then move on. You have to sit with it. And it's not a steak. It doesn't happen overnight. You need time to process what that failure is. A rule of thumb is like, how long did the failure take place? Give yourself at least that time and then move on from there, but marinate with it. So in my 3 Ps period, like I told you, I marinated in journal practices and meditations, in therapy. Like there was a lot of marinating happening. The O in Move On is own it. And by own it, it's not Susan and accounting's fault that that thing happened. Take part of your part in it. And then the biggest part of owning it, you have to forgive yourself. You can't move on and carry the weight of that. The V is verify the lessons learned. Something in that failure that is here to teach you a lesson. What are those 2 to 3 things? For me, in that 3 Ps story, it was, okay, I need to listen to my body. I need to set stronger boundaries. And if it's not a heck yes, it's a heck no for me. Then the E is evaluate your next steps. So what are the 2 to 3 action items that you're going to take from that learning experience? How are you going to put that learning into action? For me, it was, again, using those principles. I scheduled rest days. I now have 4-day work weeks, by the way. And I give to myself first every single morning before I give to anybody else. Then the O of Move On is the You have to process yet again what you've learned in the move setting before you can move on, because the N is your next failure. There's going to be another one. It's part of life. We are here to learn lessons and then to learn from them. And for some of us, teach them, which is my job. That methodology, when things happen, I literally write it down and go through it. And it has helped so many people understand that they're not alone, because everyone fails. And it helps people really see the transformation of what that failure was here to teach them.
And any additional thoughts for if you're encouraging talent development leaders to integrate this into their teams as this learning habit rather than fearing it? I think you're describing it sort of like through your method. I mean, they could be applying this method in their own
they can apply it. I want to say one thing too, after you apply this method, and after I applied it to my WTF story of the 3 Ps, which was pivoting, people pleasing, and pain, I turned it into what I call the 3 Ps remix. And I now have a different set of 3 Ps. Purpose. I know what my purpose is, teaching people how to do this work. My priorities, which I literally have an organizational chart for my priorities, and peace. So those 3 Ps are now what I identify as my 3 Ps. So for somebody listening, if you have a WTF story, or you know your team is really struggling with a WTF story, they can use the Move On method. You can literally write it down. I'm sure you have show notes. Get it, take it to them, apply it, please. The other thing is, we did this a lot during COVID. We threw quarterly failure parties. Now, you're going to say, this is nuts. But instead of creating a vision board of things that you want to happen, we got a blank PowerPoint slide and we pulled pictures onto these slides of failures that we had that quarter. And after every failure somebody shared on the team, we said, fail yeah. And that's just a way to celebrate that failure. So we made failures so much so a part of our culture that it was almost like a celebratory thing for that period of time. We don't do them anymore. We should. You can take that exercise back and take it to your team too. And even if you do it once a year, like what is your failure board for the year? It allows your team to see themselves as the human doing the work. It really makes people feel like it's okay. Because you say, failures are part of our company culture. We innovate, we fail, and then you make a mistake and then you get fired. That's not true. You make failure a part of your culture so much so that somebody can say failure to you on a weekly basis. They're going to feel like it's okay to make a mistake and learn from that mistake, and which is the whole Move On method. One thing we do, this is funny, we have a Fail Friday newsletter. I want to just say that we actually do this. We have to give our marketing manager something we failed at every week to be included in this newsletter. So I have to think every week of a failure I've had because we celebrate it in our newsletter. It's 4 fails, 3 awakenings, 2 insights, and 1 laugh. It's another acronym that we share every single week. So I guess we are still sort of celebrating failure. I just didn't really think of that until this moment.
Seems cathartic.
Yes, it is. It is. And it makes you feel more human.
Definitely. I can't help but add on that we're starting this new year right now. And maybe that's just a nice way to wrap up the failure conversation, because a lot of folks can be hard on themselves with these intentions that they have for the new year, resolutions, and then they fall into old patterns or have trouble with these new lofty goals. And so maybe like the advice there is to have some of this move on method, know that some of it's going to be a failure. I'm answering my own question, but what are your thoughts? What are your advice?
We have been really focusing on setting intentions this year. Just created a workshop about it, honestly. And for me, it's all about how do you want to feel as a person, as a human being doing the work that you're doing at your role? How do you want to feel? Start there and work backwards. Think about if you could feel this way every single day, what would that do for you? What would that do for your team? What would that do for your family? My team and I all have one word that we use as our word for the year. And then we actually break it down and we do a monthly intention setting practice where we have a word for the month. And that right there, when you say the word of how you want to feel, brings a vibe to your body. And when you feel good, you attract things into your life. You are giving to yourself, giving to those around you in a way that is magnetic. And you start to attract versus push and pull. Things feel easier. So I think starting with how you want to feel and working backwards from there, if you want to set a one-word intention for the year, do that and keep that top of mind as you decide whether or not you want to do something. If you decide, I don't want to be a people pleaser in this situation, does it go along with my intention? No, don't do it. Or if it does feel good and it is aligned with how you want to feel this year, do it. We have something called the Tomorrow Ready Checklist, which I think is super dope for anybody who wants to have more intentional setting, more intentional feeling going into 2025. So it's a freebie. It's literally a 2-pager. You make a copy of it on your phone and it's a fillable planner called the Tomorrow Ready Checklist. And it's just a checklist that you can go through once your workday stops to set yourself up for success the next day. So super easy. I'll give that to you to put in the show notes too, if people want that.
We will include that. That sounds wonderful. Okay, I am going to have to let you off the hook with all of these other burning questions I have so that we can close out for today. So let's just bring it back to you. Any current learning goals that you have going on?
Man, so many. I'm actually in a season of philanthropy right now. I'm working with the Make-A-Wish Foundation, and I live in Charleston, South Carolina. So I'm learning how to fundraise. I have never done it before. I obviously run a company, but I am raising money for a child here in South Carolina to grant a wish to them, raising $7,500. So I'm part of this Make-A-Wish Society, which is also really cool. It's this awesome group of like-minded women here in Charleston, a lot of business owners who are coming together to raise money. So I have a fundraiser here locally, and I'm going to be doing a lot of work with them over the course of the next 6 months. So for me, I'm learning how to be a philanthropic fundraiser.
Amazing. And such a wonderful impact too. How can folks keep up with your activity?
I think the easiest way is to have everyone go to my website, which is it'serindiehl.com. And there you can see my Instagram, LinkedIn. That's where I spend the most time. And then also we have a podcast too. We're actually rebranding. It was called the Improve-It podcast, but we have a new name coming out. So I don't know when this is airing, but it's coming out in February. So stay tuned for that. And then the book that I wrote all about empathetic leadership is called I See You, and that's on the website too.
Well, thank you so much, Erin. It was such a pleasure to talk to you today.
You too. Thank you. I loved it. You were amazing.
Well, hopefully our listeners got some great ideas and are going to go out there and have an amazing day.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from the Association for Talent Development. Be sure to check the show notes for resources mentioned in today's episode. And if you found the show useful or insightful, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with a colleague.